Okay, so back, we're gonna continue with evolution, and now we're gonna talk about the evidence for evolution. There's a huge amount of scientific evidence for the theory of evolution, and so far there is no scientific evidence against the theory of evolution. All right, so again, I'm gonna share my screen, and I'm gonna try to make a weird face when I do it. I hope I'm paused in a weird way. Let's see. Come on. You'll have to let me know if my pausing in weird ways works. Oh no, wrong one. Okay, so we are going to talk about the evidence of evolution. And there are 7 pieces of evidence for the scientific evidence that support the theory of evolution. And currently there's no evidence against the theory of evolution. And so there are 7. We're going to talk about all of them. There is there's biogeography. There's an intense fossil record. There are vestigial structures, homologous structures, analogous structures, embryology, and molecular biology. And a few years ago, I had my students try to come up with a way to remember this. And they came up with something that I love, and it's called beef v ham. So I always remember now that the evidence of evolution can be summarized by this amazing acronym, beef v ham, beefy ham. So we'll go through that. So this is biogeography, embryology, fossils, vestigial structures, homologous, analogous, and molecular biology. All right, so biogeography. So continental drift, you may have heard of this back many, many, many moons ago. The continents of the Earth used to be very close together. In a town called Pangea. In the Earth at that time was called Pangea. All right. And then as the continental drift caused these continents to move away from each other, they saw that there were similar species, but then they had to adapt to a changing environment. And that created new species. So if you take a large flightless bird that lived in Pangea, as the continents shifted and moved apart, they were exposed to different environmental pressures. And so these birds then evolved into different species, all right, based on those new environmental pressures. Another thing about biogeography that's really interesting is that are these islands. And I told you that islands were very important to Darwin and Wallace. And islands have species that are called endemic. And what that means is that there's species found nowhere else in the world. But those species are most similar to the species on the nearest mainland. All right, so these unique biogeography patterns of organisms help to support the theory of evolution. The fossil record is another one. And so the fossil record is a big support of the theory of evolution. So a couple things about the fossil record. One, the older organisms have been found deeper in the earth, right? So the deeper down you go, the older those organisms seem to be. And you can look, so this is, I forget, are these trilobites? I think these are trilobites. And you can see that the older they are, the kind of simpler the organisms are, and they become more kind of complex and more adapted to environmental changes as they go up. Another thing is that the appearance of transitional fossils have become very important. Transitional fossils are fossils that have traits that are common to both living species and ancestral species. So for example, an example of that are fish with legs. There's been some transitional species there. Another, we now know that kind of the dinosaur bird, right? The dinosaur, there's been fossils of dinosaurs that now look much more like birds, which is a new kind of a theory on how those evolved. And so if you look at a common ancestor, you can start to see similarities between them based on the fossil record. Okay. The next one is one of my favorites. They're called vestigial structures. All right. These are remnants of features that served an ancestral function, but have no function today, but are still there because they just we haven't, or the organism just hasn't gotten rid of them yet. All right. And some of my favorite examples here. One are horse toes. If you look at a dog and a pig and a horse, they all have the same sorts of bones. And what you'll notice is that one of these bones here, at least in the horse, it has no function now, but it is still there as a product of how this organism evolved throughout its life. The second one are snake limbs. Often, if you can look at snakes, they actually, some species have these little nubs at the base of the underneath. Those are, I'm going to put, they're called leg limbs. They're ancestral leg limbs that are not necessary today, but they do have they had an ancestral function as legs were kind of diminishing from the snake body. My all-time favorite is the whale pelvis. Whales have a pelvis. Do they walk? Do they need a pelvis, which helps hold the legs? No. I don't know if any of you have been to like the Natural History Museum in New York, and you look at the whale. They've got a fossil. They've got all the bones of a whale up hanging, and you can look and you can see this bones that are literally floating. They're not connected to any other bone in the body, but they're there. And that is a remnant from when these mammals may have at one point must have been walking organisms. All right, next is homologous structures. These are structures that are in different species, but similar due to a common ancestor, right? And what I mean by that, so if you look at the body plan of, for example, reptiles or birds or humans, you can basically trace every bone in the body and they have an intense similarity, right? Everything from the vertebrae to the rib cage to all of the feet and hand bones and the skull, all right? If you look more, whoops, oh man, how did I go all the way up there? Beep, 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 beep. Yeah. And if you look even more carefully at just the arm and finger bones, they're completely similar in terms of the body plan and the particular bones from a human, cat, whale, and a bat, right? Almost all mammals, basically. They all have a humerus, this radius and ulna, all the way down to the phalanges, all right? This is a result of divergent evolution. And divergent means they had a common ancestor, but they diverged, all right? Two or more species diverged from a common ancestor. So divergent evolution results in homologous structures, meaning structures that are different in a species, but similar because of a common ancestor. This is different than analogous structures, which are structures in different species that have a similar function, but a different origin. So what I mean by that is, for example, a study of wings. The bat wing, a butterfly wing, and a bird wing, all are wings. They are all used to fly. However, they do not have no recent common ancestor, right? They have very different common ancestors. The same with legs from an octopus, a sea star versus a grasshopper. They're all used for similar locomotion, but they are fundamentally different. They do not have a recent common ancestor. So these are superficially similar due to similar environmental pressures, all right? And this is a result of convergent evolution, where you have different common ancestors that are converging on a similar trait. All right. So a similar trait due to similar environmental pressures, but no recent common ancestor. All right, the next one is embryology. So, sorry, I always have to get my notes on this one because I actually don't know the answer unless I look. All right, so one of these, and so for these embryos at the top, we have one is a dog, one is a cow, one is a horse, and one is a human. And I want you to try to figure it out. Which is which? Right? The one I can always guess is D is human. You know why? Because we got a big old brain. All right, but then it gets very confusing. So turns out that A, whoops, did I say, whoops, it's not a dog, actually, it's a cat. A is going to be a cat. B is a cow. And C is a horse. So embryos from very different organisms all look very, very similar, right? That helps support the theory of evolution. And if you look more specifically at a human embryo, they have a couple vestigial structures. Structures are remnants of a previous ancestor that don't have a use today. The first are gill slits, right? So they have these gill slits. And we also, human embryos, have a tail, right? So embryos have gill slits and tails, even though those are not structures that actually persist as the embryo grows. All right, the last main piece of evidence that supports the theory of evolution is molecular biology, all right? And what I mean by molecular biology is DNA and protein sequence and protein structures. So if you look at the protein hemoglobin and you look at differences between humans and other vertebrates, these are the number of amino acid changes. So between humans and gorillas, 1 amino acid difference. If you go from a monkey, 8, 27 in a mouse, 45 in a chicken, and in a frog, 67. Those are single amino acid changes. Other than that, the protein is identical, all right? And if you actually look at the structure of these proteins, they actually look very similar, whether you are, a soy plant or a human, right? The structure of these proteins is very similar. So we now, as scientists, use DNA and protein as a way of seeing how similar organisms are. Historically, we didn't have the technology to look at those, so we had to rely on these other things, like structures, analogous structures, homologous structures, embryology, fossils. We now can really use molecular biology. So I just want to show 2 examples of natural selection. Remember, let's talk again. What is natural selection? So natural selection is the theory that those with favorable traits, so I'm going to just write it, those with favorable traits tend to 2 things: survive and have babies, reproduce at high rates because of those traits, due to those traits. And again, those traits have allowed them to adapt to their environment. All right, so 2 examples. One, in Florida, they have these little bugs called soap bugs that live on these weird plants, and they use their beaks to feed. The average size of the beak was about here. I forget what year, but I think it was the 1980s, if I remember. An introduced species of plant was the food source for these bugs was introduced, a non-native plant. And within 35 years, these bugs have evolved to change their beak size from about 9 millimeters down to having an average of 7, right? So within 35 years, these bugs have literally changed size dramatically based on which ones were best adapted for their new environment and which ones were able to survive and reproduce at high rates. Another example of natural selection that you may be familiar with is drug-resistant bacteria. You may have heard MRSA, multiply resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which is a type of this. So if you look at a population of bacteria, and if you add antibiotics to that, some of these bacteria may have a random mutation that lets them be resistant to that bacteria, right? So those are shown here in red. Random mutation somehow makes them better adapted to their environment. Those organisms then survive and reproduce at higher rates. And now you have gotten a population of primarily resistant bacteria. And that can happen in only a couple generations of bacteria. And we can watch evolution happen in bacteria pretty quickly because their reproduction time is only 20 minutes. All right, so key concepts. Descent with modification or evolution by natural selection helps explain the unity and the diversity of life. Natural selection does not create new traits, but it selects for traits already present in the population. The way that those are present in the population is by random mutation. You cannot create new traits that you want. They're random and then they get selected for. The local environment will determine which traits will be selected for or selected against. So this really has to do with environmental pressures that help drive evolution or drive natural selection, right? Evolution is supported by an overwhelming amount of scientific evidence. And we have those beef v. ham, right? Biodiversity, embryology, fossils, vestigial structures, homologous structures, analogous structures, and molecular biology. All right, lots of practice questions at the end. Highly recommend that you do them. Peace. Oh God, you guys are all still here. Peace again.